I think a brief review of my own resume probably convinces you that I have attention deficit disorder and I'm profoundly confused about what I'm supposed to be doing in life. But I do want to tell you a little bit about myself before we do the talk. I am absolutely thrilled to be here. And you need to know why I'm thrilled. So Dr. Banner asked me, Mark, what got you interested in science years and years ago? And I said, it was the space program. It was the Gemini program and the Apollo program. And I was absolutely fascinated by everything that was going on as it related to man's effort to get off this planet and go somewhere else. But I was even more impressed by the reporting of that space program. And many of the reporters who talked about what was going on in that program were my heroes. Jules Bergman, ABC News, was somebody I thought was God because he could explain any complex aspect of science or technology at a 5th grade level. And I understood what he was talking about. And I understood why it was cool. Because he could explain what was going on and why. So I am a generalist. And I love to understand why the world works the way it does. I am a generalist and not a scientist. But I love to try to explain, at an explainable level, complex ideas. Because I believe people who fund public research need to understand at a fundamental level why that research is important. So we're obligated to talk to you, and we're obligated to talk to each other about the science, why it's important, and to make sure as much of us understand that process as best we can. So that's why I'm thrilled to be here. When I was asked to come and do a talk within the context of this presentation or this lecture series, we wanted to talk about the war on cancer as it was named over 40 years ago. It's really a legislative initiative. And I wasn't quite sure how I was going to work in cool science and really fun stuff in the context of what may have been a boring legislative initiative to make people think about cancer 41 years ago. But Dr. Banner really pushed me. And he pushed me in a positive way because I now understand that we're going to use this war on cancer as sort of a canvas and a backdrop to talk about some of the things that I think are really cool, that have come out of research, that are going to profoundly and fundamentally impact cancer, and I hope will also cause you to think more deeply and care more deeply about if we're getting what we should be getting from the nation's research enterprise. We're often asked to say, let's fund great stuff and let's do great things, but we rarely ask the public to say, public, how are we doing in the research enterprise? And I'm going to bring out some ideas that maybe will cause you to say, we're not getting enough. And we're not getting enough fast enough from the nation's research enterprise. So I think this backdrop of the war on cancer is probably a neat way to talk about some of those things. So I'm going to share with you, we'll advance that, a quick clip of President Nixon, who is actually signing into law the National Cancer Act. A little information. There's no such thing as the war on cancer. It's not in the legislation, and President Nixon never used the term. It's a term that was used to simplify what was implied in the National Cancer Act. And we'll talk a little more about that maybe later.
Won't you be seated, please? Members of the Senate, members of the House, ladies and gentlemen. We are here today for the purpose of signing the Cancer Act of 1971. And I hope that in the years ahead that we may look back on this day and this action as being the most significant action taken during this administration. It could be, because when we consider what cancer does each year in the United States, we find that more people each year die of cancer in the United States than all the Americans who lost their lives in World War II. This shows us what is at stake. It tells us why I sent a message to the Congress at the first of this year, which provided for a national commitment for the conquest of cancer, to attempt to find a cure. And now, with the cooperation of the Congress, with the cooperation of many of the people in this room, we have set up a procedure for the purpose of making a total national commitment. I'm not going to go into the details of that procedure, except to say this. As a result of what has been done, as a result of the action which will come into being as a result of signing this bill, the Congress is totally committed to provide the funds that are necessary, whatever is necessary, for the conquest of cancer. The President is totally committed. We have a presidential panel headed by Benno Schmidt, which will report directly to the President, so that the President's influence, whenever necessary, can be used to reach this great goal. And in addition to that, all of the agencies of government, the National Institute of Health, HEW, etc., are totally committed.
So I'll stop that right there. I want to make two comments about the war on cancer, and then hopefully we can get to the cool technology stuff that I think you're really interested in hearing about. Number one, no real war on cancer, but that jargon was used by the press and lay individuals to make the concept of a national commitment to cancer research understandable. The reason that terminology was used because there was a misunderstanding 40-plus years ago that cancer represented one kind of disease. Moreover, the warlike motif made sense. One battle, one victory. That one treatment might eventually be developed as a result of research that would kill all cancers. And as a result of research, as a result of our understanding about how human genetics works, we understand that there are over 30 kinds of cancers, and an even more sophisticated understanding, we now understand that one woman's breast cancer, which looks very similarly under the microscope, actually behaves differently than the woman who has breast cancer in the same stage in the bed next to her in the hospital. We understand that cancer is complex, but we've also been able to take advantage of that complexity, and we're going to talk about that today. So no one war, no one battle, no one victory. But it's okay, because through genetics and through the research that's been funded over the last 40 years, we do have solid pathways to change the public health impact of cancer. So one more thing I'd like to give you before we move on to some of those cool things. Many people think about research, and that's that box to my far right, your far left. That's where all the basic stuff happens. And it's what the public really thinks about when Congress funds research, or the American Cancer Society funds research, or Susan G. Komen funds research. We think a lot about this box. But I want you, ladies and gentlemen, and all of our viewers on the internet, I want you to put this entire box in your head. Because the only way any of this basic science research ever makes it to a human being is after it goes through this entire process. This part called science translation, the regulatory component called the FDA, and something you've never heard of called translation to practice is a big black box that causes enormous delays in moving things that we can do today in the laboratory and are safe for human beings to receive, cause enormous delays in getting through this process into the healthcare delivery system. By the way, this timeline that says greater than 17 to 20 years, That's a mistake on my part. This one box called translation to practice, this is taking stuff where discovery is then translated into tests and treatments we can use, and then is tested in human beings, and then is approved by the FDA. It takes roughly 14 to 17 years before that stuff makes it out into accepted practice. That has nothing to do with science whatsoever. But I want this entire process in your head, ladies and gentlemen, because we're going to talk about some cool stuff that can change the course of cancer that is stuck back here and stuck in this real black box of science translation that as people who pay taxes, you should care about these things. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Only one mention here. It turns out that this science translation piece is not a big pipe through which discoveries flow. It turns out, in fact, this should be a dynamic slide where discovery is ballooned to a massive size. We know a lot about how life works. We have an enormous knowledge of physics and chemistry, most of which sits in databases at the National Institute of Health or at other institutions. That is a very big box. But the process of translation is a funnel. Very little gets through, and it takes a long time for it to get through because people have to be interested in the ideas. There have to be people who are ready to bring capital and money to certain ideas. This is a huge black box, but it is a rate-limiting step in terms of when and how human beings get the benefit or derive the benefit from research. I want you to have this entire piece in your head throughout this presentation. A little bit about cancer. So, since 1900s, cancer has been on the rise in terms of death rates for cancer. Interestingly, in 1990, the death rate from cancer began to fall. And it began to fall at a rate of 1% per year. The graph for incidence of cancer is identical to this graph. Only the incidence of cancers started to drop in the year 1991 and has continued to drop about 1% per year. So if you're fighting a war, and I'm not really sure I'm comfortable with that metaphor, not bad. Good things are happening. The principal reason for this inflection point? Tobacco control. The number one reason for the drop in overall death rates from all cancers is that, in fact, smoking is on the way down. And we can talk about that more if you'd like as well. The other reason is, in fact, technology. Better surgery, better treatment, early detection. All of these things combined, prevention with tobacco and better early detection and better treatment, is now forcing the death rate and the incidence rates down for cancer. All of those are very good things. There's two things I want you to pay attention to on this slide about risk factors and causes of cancer. We've got a lot of things going on here. Obviously, smoking still number one. Over a third of the burden of cancers is related to smoking. But you've got a lot of other stuff here. Occupational exposure, which we hear a lot about in the media. We know that viruses worldwide, about 16 to 24% of all cancers worldwide are caused by viral infections. We have, yes, family genetics. We inherit gene mutations that predispose us to certain cancers, and on and on. But there's one up on here I hope shocks the hell out of you. The number two cause or burden is actually a collection of three things: being overweight, eating improperly, and inactivity combined to produce a causal burden of cancer that is almost equal to what? Smoking. Okay? Keep that in your head, because we're going to talk a little bit about gene-environment interaction. We're a collection of genes, but we interact with our environment. And guess what, ladies and gentlemen? Diet exercise, and our weight is part of the environmental influence on our own bodies, on our own genes. But I'm still amazed that obesity, inactivity, poor nutrition ranks almost as powerfully as smoking a cigarette in terms of causing cancer and creating a cancer burden. This is just a quick slide showing the decline for both male and female in the use of tobacco. Great news, especially for a war on cancer. Unfortunately, as it stands today, middle schoolers, particularly middle school males, are increasing their rates of smoking as we speak. So unfortunately, this is great news over the past, but we've got more work to do. Technology, science, hot science, cool stuff. Where is this battle going to be waged? And I submit to you there are at least 3 areas that you need to think about, we need to talk about, that are very important in terms of that next frontier for cancer. First, there is a science called epigenetics. Epigenetics is about how our genes interact with the air we breathe, the food and water we eat, our body mass, our levels of exposure to heavy metals, to cigarette smoke, and to other cancer-causing chemicals. In the area of epigenetics, they're going to be focusing principally on gene-environmental interaction. And if you hear about it on television, if you read about it, you need to pay attention to it, because it's the next big area that will help each of you individually understand your cancer risk. It is entirely possible, these gorgeous women dressed in red here may only need to eat broccoli 2 times more per week to be protected from breast cancer. The field of gene-environment interaction is going to help us understand that, their gene profile versus what they need from the environment. I am praying that I don't have to eat broccoli to save my life. But this field that I want you to begin paying attention to, gene-environment interaction, is an area that can help you understand your personal risk. Second, high technology is going to give us precision screening and precision diagnosis of most cancers. And finally, that whole thing about discovery on through translation into the FDA, on through translation into practice, into the healthcare system. You need to care about health policy as well, because you should be demanding that that process works faster. Because there are answers that exist in databases today, databases that do not talk to each other. They don't talk to the investigators who want to talk to them, but have answers that we can use if we can just get them out and move them through the science process. So, gene-environment interaction. I can't think of a better way in explaining this to you other than saying that, in fact, gene-environment interaction is about when DNA meets the world. When I went to medical school at Tulane, you were either born with good genes or you weren't. You were born with the gene that gave you cancer, or you were born with genes that, in fact, protected you from cancer. The world of gene-environment interaction says that the number of mutations you're born with that result in certain kinds of diseases is tiny. It's infinitesimal. That, in fact, most of the gene changes that occur that result in ill health or high risk as it relates to disease happens after we're born, and happens as a result of decisions we make about food, exercise, body weight, and also other environmental exposures. So, gene-environment interaction has us ask questions like this. If smoking is the most common cause of lung cancer, and it is, why do only 10 to 20% of heavy smokers ever develop lung cancer? The answer is in genes, gene profiles, and how those genes interact with a specific set of environmental conditions. So, it's very important, even when we're taking in carcinogens, to begin understanding our bodies, our DNA, and how it interacts with the world around us. This is a standard slide of a woman about to receive a mammogram. The technician is holding her hand over the machine, directing the lady where to go. And although this is a very serious slide, I always look at this slide and I look at this woman's expression, and what I hear her saying is, "You want me to put what? Where?" We're going to have to do a better job with technology when it comes to screening for breast cancer than we do today. But here's the question that gene environment causes us to ask, and you need to pay attention as scientists answer these questions. Why are the rates of breast cancer high in the United States? They're not high everywhere. And in the U.S., interestingly, most women do not develop breast cancer. I am not trying to minimize breast cancer in women. I'm simply telling you, most women will not develop or die from breast cancer. And the field of gene-environment interaction is going to tell you more about you so that you can make better choices, or that we can actually help you with technology to get around maybe a set of genes that's turned on or off that may predispose you to either breast cancer or lung cancer or some other cancer. So pay very close attention to the field of gene-environment interaction. This field is going to tell us whether eating more of this stuff, exercising more, is going to make a difference. Gene-environmental interactions is going to tell us when we should take extra special precautions against exposures like sun or cigarette smoke. So again, it's an important area and I want you to pay close attention to it. Comprehensive answers are coming from this field of epigenetics and gene-environmental interaction. So this is sort of a summary piece of gene-environment interaction. Starting with DNA, turns out there are certain kinds of gene changes that can occur. As a result of that, these gene changes occur in the individual. For example, a single gene cancer that comes from a single gene mutation in DNA is chronic myelogenous leukemia, CML, something many of you have heard about. Turns out that that gene mutation causes a protein to misbehave and be reproduced in abnormal numbers. But the really cool thing about it is there's a drug called Gleevec that sets all of that straight. So it's important to know about genes, how they work, how they create risk, and also how they might be able to help us in terms of treating and curing certain kinds of cancers that are incurable today. So DNA flows to the individual flows into that individual's population. And again, I want you now to pay attention to studies that are being done on large groups of people to help us understand how their DNA interacts with the choices they make and their environment to create risk, or maybe to reduce risk. And so the Harvard Nurses Health Study is a very important one, been going on for a long time. Also, the American Cancer Society Cancer Prevention Study Series 1, 2, and 3 are also very important in terms of answering questions about your genes, our genes, and how the environment affects all of that. And lastly, I want you to begin thinking about environment, now including diet, now including levels of exercise, as well as environmental exposure. We might debate about that. Some of you might buy that, others maybe not so much. So this is a summary showing you that there really is a flow between our DNA and the environment, and these elements of the environment, and resulting in either single gene mutations, which are rare, or small changes in DNA, or even gene-gene interactions that produce disease. Is obesity a medical, genetic, or environmental cause of cancer? One study involving 1 million human beings has demonstrated that if your body mass index is in the range of those who are obese, you have a 19% higher chance of dying not getting, but dying from cancer, simply because your body mass index is too high and we carry too much fat. What we do not know is whether obesity is an environmental exposure onto our genes inside of our body, because we don't know what the exact connection between obesity and cancer is. We simply know there is a powerful association. But understanding gene-environmental interactions will help us. Here's something scary. 1970, adults, 15% of Americans were obese. 2008, 35% of American adults are obese. 1970, children, 4% of children were considered obese in 1970. Today, 20% of children are considered obese. Why is this important? This is going to drive cancer rates for the next 50 years. So even as we develop new, powerful, extraordinary, selective, precise treatments, even as that is happening, and it is happening, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to continue to drive cancer rates up because of a condition that is probably easily dealt with in the sense of architects changing the way we build cities, architects and engineers changing the way we build buildings, changing the way we work. So we walk. Every time I'm in Europe, was just there, I lose weight. I eat more food in Europe than I do here because it's wonderful food. I lose weight because I walk everywhere. I use public transportation, and it never fails. No matter how much foie gras I eat, I lose weight because of the built environment. My meetings, I have to walk to them. To get back to my hotel, I have to walk. And so changing our environment from an engineering perspective may actually be able to help us with one of the principal causes driving cancer rates into the next decade. This is just a summary slide showing you gene environment affects community, the delivery system, employers and businesses as it relates to their cost on insurance. It really affects the media. I feel bad for the media because this stuff is complex stuff. It's difficult to explain. And in fact, much more difficult than explaining the space program. Gene-environment interaction, important to understand your risk. One quick word, American Cancer Society, we're enrolling 300,000 people nationally. We're collecting DNA. We are then going to follow those individuals for 20 to 30 years with a health survey. And I signed up, they've taken my blood, and they will be terrorizing me for the next 20 years asking for my health survey, and I'm happy to give it to them. Because this is the only study that is a population-based study helping us understand gene-environment interactions that people can volunteer for. NIH doesn't have any of those, so I did want to make you aware of that. And we actually enrolled people in Austin, Texas several months ago. So, technology. What are the two basic problems in cancer that if you solve them, cancer would no longer become an issue? Number one, find it at the cell level before it becomes a tumor and you prevent cancer from happening. Number two, if you can find it at the cell level, a few cells, a few hundred cells, in fact, if you're able to kill those cells, cancer becomes an entirely curable disease or preventable as a vaccine type of disease might be. And it turns out that since the 1800s, remember that big spectrum of discovery and translation and FDA and figuring out how to get in the healthcare system? Something called circulating tumor cells was discovered in the 1800s with a high-power microscope. Circulating tumor cells can be found in the blood at about a level of 10 per ml. And in fact, if you can find them, you can diagnose cancer early. And if you can treat them, you can again make cancer entirely curable. We now know that if you can find circulating tumor cells and profile their genes, you can even tell whether your prostate cancer is going to be easy to treat or whether or not it will be difficult to treat. This is being done now in clinical research. This has not made it out into the public yet. It has not been translated fully through clinical trials. It has not made it into the FDA, but one company, Johnson & Johnson, at the beginning of this year, gave a research team at MIT, Mass General, MD Anderson, who got together and made a machine that draws 1 teaspoon of blood from the body, puts it through this sophisticated machine, and the machine can find all the way down to 100 cancer cells and can pick them out. And you can see them through fluorescence. The machine exists today. They were able to do that in 2007. Johnson & Johnson just came along and is funding the further translation because it costs $500 to do this test per test. And we've got to get it down to $2 per test so we can move it out into the clinic. This capability of finding circulating tumor cells exists today. And in fact, there's a capability of sorting through those cells, finding them, identifying them today. But you won't see this for quite a long time because we've got a bottleneck on translational science. And we've got to get through translational science to the FDA after clinical trials. And we've got to get through the FDA, and when it becomes available as a proven capability of screening either an existing cancer patient or maybe a patient who is precancerous, it will still take 15 to 20 years to have everybody adopt it and use it. So you keep that framework in your head. By the way, this is a photograph of a cancer cell drawn from blood. Blood was drawn, put through a high throughput capability with some sticky antibodies in certain parts of the machine. These 3 cells are cancer cells. This was drawn from about 3 teaspoons or a tablespoon of blood. Nothing special, no biopsy, taken directly from the blood, and the machine was able to identify those cancer cells. We can find individual cancer cells when? Today. The engineering has been done. This can be done. It is currently a research tool. But if there's a way of translating it more quickly to the market, to you and your family and your neighbors, we may be able to literally find cancer at the level of a few cells instead of millions of cells. In prostate cancer, we've already seen that circulating tumor cells and the numbers of those cells tells us whether you're going to do well or do poorly with therapy. If you have a lot of circulating tumor cells, we know that you're at high risk for metastasis. And an article in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2004 for breast cancer told us the same thing. Counting circulating tumor cells before you were treated told us whether you were going to be at high risk or low risk for metastasis, whether your prognosis was going to be very good or not so good. So being able to tell whether you have a lot of circulating tumor cells matters. But, of course, that's not clinically available today. Looking at the DNA profile of some circulating tumor cells for prostate cancer, it turns out that if you have a bad genetic profile in your circulating tumor cells for prostate cancer, you will die earlier. Your prognosis is worse simply by taking a teaspoon of blood, running it through a machine, counting those cells, which we can do now with the machine. You can tell doctors, you may need to be more aggressive with this patient, or you may need to use a different kind of therapy. I want to say this, and I'm not being glib at all. Most cancer therapy occurs in the following way and in the following time sequence. You are diagnosed with a tumor. We decide what kind of treatment you're going to get. We treat you. You go away for 3 months. We ask you to come back in 3 months. And then we take another look to see if, in fact, the treatment has done any good. Counting circulating tumor cells over a very short period of time can tell a doctor very quickly whether your therapy is working or whether it's not working. And without any advances in science, this may save lives. If we can know within 2 days whether your therapy is working or not, we may be able to change, as opposed to go away for 3 months and come back and hopefully that tumor's not bigger. Circulating tumor cells, can find them today. We can count them today. We can look at their genetics today. And in the case of prostate cancer, we even know what the prognosis is if you have certain kinds of DNA profile in those bad tumor cells. Well, let's talk about precision screening. This is what we do today, ladies and gentlemen, and this is what I spend a lot of my time convincing people to do. To go get a colonoscopy, to go get a sigmoidoscopy, to be screened in some fashion for colon cancer. Why? Because colon cancer is one of the cancers that if we find a polyp, we can actually prevent the cancer altogether. There are people running around called previvors. The doctors found that polyp, they removed the polyp, and they're not going to develop colon cancer. They're actually previvors. And this is the traditional way that we do this. Based on studies that have already been done and clinical trials that are already being designed, this thing, which is an artist's mock-up of a gold nanoparticle, may be a way of dramatically increasing the precision of looking for colon tumors. And not only that, gold nanoparticles may be able to help us find flat polyps, which are the most malignant and the most difficult to find. And if you haven't followed the PrEP regimen to a great deal of precision, you won't find flat polyps. But it may not matter because they've already created contrast media and tested it with gold nanoparticles, and in a wonderful way, they adhere as a result of permeability. Cancer cells are highly permeable cells. They not only take in glucose very quickly and use it, but they take in dense particles like gold nanoparticles. And they show up beautifully as a result of some studies that have already been done. So real quick, nano stuff. I know you guys are scientists. I know you're interested in science. You know about nano stuff. But this is a nice explanation of the scale of nano stuff. So here's a tennis ball on a nano scale. This tennis ball is not that much smaller than many tumors that are found in late cancers. This is a period. You know that goes in the end of a sentence. The English talk about full stop. My kids don't use periods. Don't know about you guys. But this period, which is much smaller, is quite larger, actually, than a cancer cell. So as we go down this scale, things get smaller and smaller. Here's a cancer cell. Cancer cell is bigger than a bacteria. A bacteria is bigger than a virus. And a virus is bigger than most antibodies. In this area, science, and a group actually in Dallas, or in Houston rather, working with MD Anderson and a Nano Alliance group, is creating nanoparticles that go and find cancer, that go and destroy cancer cells, that go and illuminate those cancer cells so we can see them at a cellular level and not have to wait until they're as big as this tennis ball. Happening today, ladies and gentlemen. This is not future science. This is stuff that's in laboratories. And we're still trying to figure out how to translate it so we can test it in humans and then make it entirely available. This is one of my favorite nano slides. Can you see this? Folks from the internet. Folks here, do you know what this is? What does that look like? It's a rat, okay? And this shows you a little bit about how engineers and scientists really do have senses of humor. So what this is these three areas, green, yellow, and red, are places where human prostate cancer has been left to grow on the spine of this rat. These engineers at Georgia Tech, working with the Winship Cancer Institute, this was in Nature Biotech several years ago, they coated quantum dots, which when you shine light on them, they actually give off light. They coated quantum dots with antibodies to human prostate cancer. They injected many of these quantum dots into the blood of this animal. And lo and behold, the quantum dots only show up where the tumor is. This advance in nanotechnology is important because if we can find circulating tumor cells down to the level of about 100 cells, or maybe 150 cells, And then we further developed the capability of injecting something into the blood that only goes and finds pancreatic cancer, only finds hepatic cancer, only finds breast cancer. We know at the quantum level and at the level of nanotechnology, those particles can find their way and localize into the tumors we're interested in. Now, by the way, the humorous part of this is, any of you drivers, what does that look like to you drivers? Looks like a stop sign, doesn't it? So the engineers were just showing off because they can actually tune these quantum dots any color they want. And they simply shone near infrared light on the back of this animal, and that's what showed up. Okay? So the capability to build nanoparticles smaller than cancer cells and direct them to where they need to go exists when? They exist today, right? Say it. It exists today. Okay? This is not moonshot stuff. It exists today. And the question I want to leave you with is, when are we going to get this? When are we going to get human trials? Will there be enough money to push this through the translational process so that we can take advantage of that in our lifetime? I call this guy Bruce, by the way. I have no idea why I call it Bruce. But by the way, there are 3 million quantum dots inside of each cell. This represents an aggregation of cells. This is a tumor. There are 3 million quantum dots that have localized themselves into those cells. You can get a lot of them inside a small space. We can now use gold nanoparticles to look for colon cancer. And I explained a little bit about that earlier. So, can we fix this? Can we speed this along? And I'm not talking about speeding bad science forward. Okay, I'm talking about taking stuff that seems to work and do the things we want it to do in cancer, test whether it's safe, and move it forward. That's an important question for you, whether you're a scientist or just another taxpayer. We should all care about that process. We need to accelerate translation for those things that belong out into the healthcare delivery system. Now, a really tall, really skinny guy giving a speech at NIH, at the NIH Clinical Center, during a Martin Luther King Day presentation said this, and I think this sums up the cool science as well as the stuff we really should care about. The policy aspect. The highest, and you know there's an argument that always goes on with PhDs about pure science and I shouldn't really care. Well, that's okay. But in biomedical science, we always care whether it gets to human beings. We always care in biomedical science. Okay, we'll take stuff from physics. We'll take stuff from chemistry. We'll take it from engineering. But once it becomes biomedical science, we care that it actually gets to human beings. So, the highest and best purpose of biomedical science is realized when the knowledge derived from research is used to improve the human condition. So, sharing circulating tumor cells with you and telling you we can find them today and telling you that we can target them with nano devices, that's wonderful stuff. But as a generalist, a non-scientist, I care if that stuff actually gets to human beings. And the reason why I'm so glad to be here today is because I want you to care about this as well. Thank you.
Dr. Clanton will be happy to answer questions. Please have at it.
Right here in the middle. Do you want to use that mic? Cancer at a cellular level. So the question is, I think, if this technology makes it into the clinic and insurance pays for it, okay, how will that work? In terms of circulating tumor cells, no, you won't have to be injected with anything. What we need are chips, high-throughput devices that you can just click right into a machine, run some blood through it. It'll go and find cells. It'll be programmed to, probably with antibodies to certain cancers. And blood will go through that, and it will pull out those cells. And again, in an automated way, you can say, boom, at risk for hepatic cancer. In fact, it's possible to do DNA testing on these chips as well. You could actually run it through a chip that will find the cells, do a genetic analysis of the cell. This is engineering. It is not science. And in fact, get a printout that says hepatic carcinoma, this type, and maybe even get prognosis information. That is not from, there was a program I looked at when I was a kid, produced by Union Carbide. It was about science in the future. It's not that kind of stuff at all. That capability exists. And combining chips to be able to do multiple functions has already been perfected in terms of looking at the human genome, looking at the genome of cancer tumors, and simply drawing blood and running it through, and you wouldn't have to inject anyone with anything. Gorgeous question. Gorgeous question. Listen to this question. The question was, if it's possible to find circulating tumor cells, which you can do, because we've known about them since 1840 whatever, does that mean that it's too late to treat you? Not at all. In fact, we already know that by finding early stage cancers, we can improve survival. You can improve prognosis. Early stage cancers that are a few centimeters large have millions of cancer cells in them. If the technology that was produced by this group out of MIT and MD Anderson, et cetera, that machine can find cancer cells out of 1 ml of blood down to the level of 134 cancer cells. The machine can do that. So no, it's great news if we can find cancer at that level. The next big question is, can we treat you at that micro level, or are we going to ask you to wait until some point where we can treat you early enough to save you, but not early enough to eliminate the cells? That's the question. Yes, ma'am.
Thanks for the great talk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the translation funnel that you described and what you think some of those barriers are. Okay, so what is translation? Translation is where the basic science sort of meets the clinical science. Clinical science is the part where human beings are involved. And the basic science may only be molecules and physics and forces and that sort of thing. Translational science happens in a special place, and it happens with special people. It happens with a combination of PhDs, often who are doing the basic science, and MDs or MD PhDs and other clinical personnel, where they're now thinking about how to take this cool stuff and make it work for human beings. Translation is where clinical stuff meets the basic sciences and how the engineering occurs to make that work for a test or a treatment. It turns out that that space is highly unstructured. We actually don't provide incentives to train PhDs to want to care about translation. We don't provide incentives and training for MDs to learn about the basic sciences piece. When I was in undergraduate school, there was actually an NIH program that was recruiting physicians to be MD PhDs and also make money and training available for PhDs who wanted to kind of be in this strange space. So we have PhD players, we have MD players, and we have technology players there as well. Technology is critical to making the translation piece work. And guess what, ladies and gentlemen? Engineers still don't talk to doctors, and doctors still don't talk to PhDs. So the translational space is still highly unstructured and disorganized. And in many ways, what comes out of there may have more to do with a funding source that wants to see that particular test come forward. And I think we can do better. Yes?
So you had made a statement that you want to push forward science, but make sure you don't push forward bad science. So if this area is so unstructured and it's taking very long, if we start pushing harder on this translational area, how do you prevent the necessary tests and measures being taken, and so that bad science doesn't move forward? Because I can see in an analysis phase, maybe bad science goes through and an analysis doesn't run correctly, but in actually screening someone within their body and then injecting something into their body, if bad science gets pushed through, that's going to have a lot of consequences.
Absolutely, absolutely. So again, if you push things too quickly through translation and in the wrong way, you can end up with bad stuff. So, 2 points, at least one if I can remember two. 2 points. That's what clinical trials are for. Now let me make an example. We have to test all this stuff in human beings. If it doesn't work, it doesn't belong in the market. Okay? What percentage, this is for you, I can't hear you in the internet, but answer the question if you can. Okay? What percentage of Americans who are diagnosed with cancer participate in clinical trials? Number, just say a number. That's ridiculous. I can't understand any of that. 3% of Americans who get diagnosed with cancer participate in clinical trials. In order to feed the translational machine, in order to answer questions about does this thing really work or is that thing really safe, we probably need about 30% of the people who are diagnosed with cancer to participate in clinical trials. In the United Kingdom, on the issue of breast cancer, they had a national health initiative that took their 2% of women with breast cancer participating in clinical trials, which is what tells you whether your genes are going to work with that therapy. Remember the whole gene environment thing? It's relevant here too. They were able to take it to 6% nationally, which is huge, and it's been celebrated. So the issue is we need to fund more clinical trials. We need to fund them at a higher level. It actually should be a national priority to say, if I have cardiovascular disease and it's being studied, if I have cancer and that cancer is being studied in a clinical trial, if I have diabetes and my kind of diabetes is being studied in that trial, there should be a national capability that says, we will pay for that and we will make sure that you can participate in that. That's policy. That's politics. And that has nothing to do with science. And that feeds good science making its way into the public.
Say, Mark, we're going to interrupt with a question from the internet. This question comes from Victoria. She asks, why are breast cancer rates in the U.S. higher than the rest of the world?
Thank you, Victoria. It's a multiple set of issues. It turns out that things like smoking, to a small degree, do contribute to breast cancer risks. And young women in America, middle school and up, are beginning to smoke more. They're going against the trend. So smoking is an issue. But probably the one thing that we don't understand the connection for perfectly, but the International Agency for Cancer Research still classifies it as a carcinogen for breast cancer, is obesity. Weight may be driving some of the rates of cancer. Now there's a third one that I have to be very careful with, because there's more evidence in colon cancer than there is in breast, but I want to bring it up anyway. Low vitamin D levels have been associated more powerfully with colon cancer and colon cancer risk. But there is weak data and studies that are okay, that probably need to be repeated with larger numbers of women. But low vitamin D levels, which are prevalent in the U.S. population, about 60% of American women have vitamin D levels below optimal levels, around 30 or so, which is okay for bone but not much of else, may also be contributing to some cancers as well. But weight, body weight, may be an important factor in breast cancer.
Yeah, there seems to be some pushback in the popular media about the idea that obesity is tied to long-term ill health, and of course you noted it as number 2 reason. Can you comment on that? Is that just pure denialism, or? Well,
notice I cheated. Did you notice how I cheated? You remember the slide? It was obesity plus exercise plus diet. We did lump all those things together. So let me say something a little paradoxical, because we're trying to get a truth, right? It turns out that exercise is unbelievably powerful when it comes to health. You can take someone at almost any body weight, and you can prove me wrong at some body weight, obviously, BMI, 34 or something. But you can take someone at almost any body weight, and if they exercise regularly, and they walk regularly, and they have decent cardiovascular fitness, and their cholesterol is not out of control, those people have a better prognosis relative to health and illness than the exact same person at the exact same weight who does very little in terms of exercise. So I realize it's a little controversial, and there's got to be a scale somewhere on here, right? But the truth is, it turns out activity is a powerful force in health. And what we want to do is marry activity with normalizing body weight, normalizing diet, and bringing those things together. And the collection, plus avoiding environmental toxins like cigarette smoke, probably have collectively the most powerful effect. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for being patient.
No problem. This is more a simple question, but how do we get involved in the survey that you were talking about earlier?
Well, first of all, again, the American Cancer Society, the Cancer Prevention Study 3 study, is still open in some areas of the country. Now, what we can do is we can direct you to the American Cancer Society website, looking at Cancer Prevention Study 3. You can go there, you can search on that, and look for areas. Fortunately, and maybe unfortunately, we did do an enrollment for Central Texas, and we did do an enrollment for Austin. So again, go to the American Cancer Society website, look for CPS 3, see if there's an area that you might be able to participate in. And I think that's the best answer I can give. My colleague sitting here, does that sound okay? Coming back to Austin. So before we leave, young lady, we're going to get together and we'll sort that out. Yes, ma'am.
So earlier this year, I got diagnosed with having a lot of heart plaque. So I did research and discovered, and my cardiologist supported me becoming a vegan. As in my research, I found out a vegan diet, there's trials showing it helps with prostate cancer, breast cancer, and a whole variety of other things, which makes me feel better about making that choice. So my question, and looking at the China study by Colin Campbell and others, how much, I have much more belief personally now that diet makes a really big difference. So I wanted to get your sort of knowledge of the field for eating meat, saturated fats, processed foods, why that isn't more out there in the general public, why we don't want to do that. And the cancer seemed to be tying in as well as cardiovascular disease.
This is about the vegan diet and its potential for health, particularly in cancer. So two things are important about the vegan diet, maybe more than two, maybe 3 or 4 or whatever, but the two most important ones are total calories. There is something about total calories. A lot of calories pushes our metabolic rate forward. We burn energy at a very high rate, taking in too many calories. There is something about too many calories, period, irrespective of what those calories are, and what happens relative to maybe hormone levels and gene activity in our body that is somehow switching on oncogenes, which result in cancer. So vegans tend to eat, on balance, I was not a vegan but a vegetarian. I know it's hard to tell now, but a long time ago. We tend to eat fewer calories in aggregate, and that produces better body mass index. So calories good. Then you go to what we're eating. And again, you tend to eat less saturated fat, and you tend to eat more plant-based stuff, particularly soy. And soy has a wonderful effect on hormone levels and helps normalize certain hormone levels and may be protective as well. So we know that soy protein is protective for certain kinds of cancer, particularly prostate cancer. So you eat more plant-based stuff, you eat fewer calories, you have lower body mass, and in fact, overall good health. It's a good thing. But this is what I want to share with you. As somebody who's been fighting a weight-related issue for 20 years of my life, there's stuff I can do, and there's stuff I just can't do, just from a behavioral level. And so what I'm really hoping for, and you don't have to wait for this, but as we understand more about gene-environment interaction, I want to understand what my gene profile is. and I want to get a better idea based on my gene profile about what I can do, and particularly things I can do that I want to do, broccoli isn't going to be one of them, okay? I'm not going to eat broccoli. But gene environment studies are going to help me a lot in saying I can actually do some of this stuff, and I actually like some of that stuff. And if I can do more of that, maybe I can garner better health overall. But yes, fewer calories good. In fact, there was an ultra-low calorie group who actually, just like ultramilers who, go 100 miles on a gallon of gas. There are people who actually will eat, some nuts or whatever during the day and actually try to burn a few calories. Low calories, low saturated fat, a variety in terms of your plants. Most people will benefit from that. Yes?
As far as the research goes, as you said, there's lots of different kinds of cancer. How do they, make that proportion? Is it which cancers affect more people, which cancers metastasize more, which cancers have higher survival rates? I mean, obviously there's only limited money into research. How do they allocate that?
Wow, that's a powerful question.
I have an incredibly rare brain cancer, so that's why I asked.
That's a very powerful question. The question has to do with how are research and resource allocations made based on what kind of cancers there are. And you know that breast cancer, lung cancer, colorectal cancers predominate in terms of total cost, total burden, total treatment. There are pancreatic cancer, which is a very lethal cancer, is probably number 4 or 5 on the list. And as someone who is at the National Cancer Institute, there is an ongoing discussion, there is ongoing advocacy, there is ongoing lobbying of Congress to say that cancers that are not well-resourced need to be resourced at a higher level. I was actually involved in a discussion related to lung cancer, which many think is fundamentally under-resourced in terms of research. Brain cancers, which often are rare, are often under-resourced. So it's often an issue that is not related to science or even science policy that answers your question. It's often that marketplace of ideas and advocacy that often determines what cancers get what kind of resources. Let me share one other thing. Let me tell you how funky and interesting the United States is. Okay? How many people here know that there is one disease that if you have that disease, the federal government will pay for your treatment? Anybody know that? Oh, I know you know that. Put your hand down. Put your hand down. Okay? If you have chronic end-stage renal disease as a result of a political decision made years and years ago, but you didn't know this, if you have chronic end-stage renal disease, you don't have to worry about Medicare. You don't have to worry about your insurance. The United States government has a program that will pay for you to get dialysis. And it turns out the congressman who put this forward had a relative who had chronic end-stage renal disease. I'm only putting that forward to say how we make decisions about how much research and for what, and how much treatment and for whom is not yet rational. And I'm not going to get into a more open discussion about things that we've tried to discuss in the last 4 or 5 years. But we are not yet at a rational place in terms of making the kind of decisions you're talking about. So thank you for that question. Yes?
Is there any specific suggestions you would have for the everyday taxpayer in terms of what they can do to help the translational process get speeded up between MD and PhD?
That's a great question. What can the everyday taxpayer do? I think the everyday taxpayer who writes to their congressman or to their senator isn't putting a whole lot of pressure on their congressman or their senator today to make that thing work faster. Okay? Why aren't we funding better training for PhDs and MDs and collaborative research? I'm going to make another statement. I will absolutely get in trouble for this, but that's okay. The National Institute of Health has been trying to figure out, at least since I was there in 2004, how to come up with rules that are then transmitted to universities that allow teams of cross-disciplinary scientists to work together and get credit that allows them to apply for tenure. I will tell you right now, no matter what they've written, it doesn't work. That the system is still set up for individual investigators to write their individual grants, to get credit for those individual grants, and then to apply for tenure based on that process. Translation requires a reworking of the system so that people get credit for working together and working outside of their areas. Right now, no one is writing emails to their congressman or their senator saying, you guys need to fix this. Make it easier for scientists in environmental science and physics and biostatistics and mathematics. Make it easier for them to work together. Okay? Give the FDA more money. How much does the FDA, an important part of this translational effort, anybody know what the FDA budget is? Okay, that's all right. Trick question. The FDA budget was smaller than my portfolio at NCI. As deputy director, my portfolio was $1.3 billion. That's how much was in my leadership portfolio. That's bigger than the total amount of money we fund the Food and Drug Administration with. And everything that goes from that box in discovery, that goes through translation and clinical trials, has to go to the FDA. So even good stuff has trouble going through. Nobody yet is writing their Congress saying, we need to resource the FDA, which basically oversees about 10% of the gross domestic product. So that's how I would do it if I were asking people to come together and care more about what comes out of this process. So great question. Thank you. Yes?
We have time for one more question.
Vitamin D deficiency has been implicated in a lot of cancers and many other diseases. But to get enough vitamin D, you have to be out in the sun, which increases skin cancer risk. So how do you balance those two competing?
Okay, beautiful question. So, boy, we could talk for another couple hours about the science and policy issues behind vitamin D. But, beautiful question. Vitamin D, in now multiple studies, in some large studies involving 20,000 people, the Intermountain Health Study, has been shown low levels are associated with higher stroke levels, higher myocardial infarction, higher levels of GI cancer, specifically colon cancer, and other diseases as well. And yes, bone cancers as well. I mean, not bone cancer, but thinning bones. But the principal way, and boy, you're sharp, the principal way we get vitamin D is not from the diet, but from sun exposure. A good 15 minutes in the sun with your arms and legs exposed produces 20,000 international units of vitamin D from your liver. Okay? Most of the D we get is from sun exposure. But we tell people, what do we tell people relative to sun exposure? Limit sun exposure to reduce the risk of squamous cell cancers and even melanoma, even though there's not a direct correlation. So there's a little bit of a paradox here. So unfortunately, the science isn't at a place where I can tell you, or where anyone can tell you, well, if you can't get it from the sun safely, and you're not going to get it from your diet safely, then you probably need to take supplements. Unfortunately, a lot of large population studies either are underway and have not been completed, or have not been designed to answer the question, how much vitamin D should you take? Personally, I'm taking about 2,000 international units, and it's based on my blood levels, which are low. I don't spend a lot of time in the sun. But we can't spend a lot of money in the healthcare system getting everybody to get their D level tested. Interestingly enough, OBGYNs actually draw vitamin D levels on women they see fairly regularly. OBGYNs actually have a better handle on vitamin D levels in the population than any other kind of physician. Family practitioners are beginning to catch up very rapidly on this issue. But I can't tell you exactly how much to take, but I know it's more than 200 or 400 international units, which is what the current recommendation is. I'm a pediatrician. The standard dose of vitamin D for a newborn infant is 400 international units a day. And that's how much we tell adults to take. One other nice little thing, one other thing, genetics. It turns out that we have vitamin D receptors on virtually every cell in our body. Isn't that interesting? But it turns out you can have genetic changes in the structure of your vitamin D receptor so that the affinity of that receptor for vitamin D is either increased or decreased. There are genetic mutations, and this is why it's difficult to tell you exactly how much to take yet. There are genetic mutations of vitamin D receptors that make people relatively resistant to any amount of vitamin D they would take orally or in the diet. And those people may be at even higher risk for diseases related to low D. My best answer for you, and it's a crummy answer, I understand, is if we understand the genetics of vitamin D receptors, and we do a better job working out the mechanism of how vitamin D is involved in health, we may be able to tell you individually how much D to take. Right now I'm taking about 2,000 international units, and Dr. Walt Willett, the Harvard School of Public Health, is pretty strong in that being more than safe and probably not being enough for most Americans. So there you go. Not giving you a doctor recommendation, there's your disclaimer, but that's a number floating around in the literature. Thank you.
I'm sure Dr.